of the Brattleboro Historical Society. There will be a very short membership meeting right after our presentation today, to which all of you are more than welcome to attend and are invited to attend. We need to take time to do some of our legal elections, which has to happen at one of our annual meetings. I'd like to call your attention to a couple of items that may interest some of you. The first one is, as a fundraising project, we printed, along with the Brattleboro Stamp Club, some first day of issue cachets, I think the proper term is. And what that amounts to is an envelope with the official Vermont Bicentennial stamp canceled on the day of the 200th anniversary of our statehood. And those are available for you if you choose. They're at the table in the back. We were hoping to have today something we're very excited about, but I'm going to tell you about it anyway. And if you are interested, you can call any one of us on the Board of Trustees, one of or more of which number will be found in the newsletters, which you are all welcome to take a copy of, which are also at the back table. But we have published the first, actually, history of aviation in Brattleboro. It was written by one of our most treasured members, who has since left us, Dick Mitchell, who wrote the history in 1984 and had it as one of his wishes to see that it got published. Well, we finally did it, and we searched through ours and other people's collections of photographs to find suitable photographs to go along with the history, and it is literally hot off the presses as of Monday or Tuesday. We wanted to have it done today, but it just didn't happen. So that will be available to you too, and you will see that if you attend any of our functions. It's a wonderful history, and I'm sure you'll appreciate it. I'd like to call your attention to one event that's happening in the near future that we are sponsoring. On October 5th, the Southern Vermont History Alliance, in cooperation with the Brattleboro Historical Society, is beginning a project involving both the collection of primary documentation of World War II, this being the 50th anniversary of the beginning of the war, and coordinating that with Brattleboro Union High School with the history students, getting them involved in collecting World War II history and using it as a research tool. The rare part of this is getting them to do it from primary documents. So on October 5th, which is a Saturday from about 10 to noon, you're all welcome to come to the Brattleboro Historical Society, where these people will be and we will be, to both look at the items that they've already collected, either as gifts or as loans, or if you perhaps want to donate something for this project, either as a gift or as a loan, you can do that on that date. I'd like to welcome all the members of the Reed Society who are here. I know some of you are here anyway. We were able to get an announcement for this meeting in your newsletter, and we welcome you here. We hope you have already been to the number 6 Estey building and to the Historical Society room. But if you haven't, you will at least have a chance to go up to the Historical Society after our meeting. It's going to be open and available to you. We have a number of Estey-related artifacts up there, including 2 of our many organs displayed. I'd also like to introduce and welcome 2 great, if I'm not mistaken, great-grandchildren of Jacob Estey who are here today. Joseph Estey from White River Junction and his sister Margaret are here with us. Could you please stand up? father was Wilson Estey, but I don't know your grandfather or your great-grandfather. Do you by any chance?
Grandfather was Joseph, and great-grandfather was Julius.
Okay. Julius, Jacob, and Levi Fuller being the three main elements in the Estey Corporation. Okay, now it's with great pleasure that I introduce our guest speaker today. Dennis Waring, among other things, is an ethnomusicologist. He's a musician, he's an instrument maker, he's an author, he's an educator. He's currently from Connecticut, where he has taught in Connecticut at Eastern Connecticut State University, the University of Connecticut. He's also taught at Wesleyan University, and the University of Manitoba. He has developed arts and humanities programs in various places, including Vermont. He's a folk artist, he's a craftsman, and he's a maker of traditional ethnic instruments. He's the author of Making Wood Folk Instruments, and he's the author of this book entitled The Estey Reed Organ, Imagination, Music, and Material Culture in 19th Century America, which is also his doctoral dissertation. He's a friend of ours as the Historical Society, and he's a friend of Brattleboro because he has done the definitive research on Jacob Estey and the Estey experience, so to speak. So I would, without further ado, like to welcome and introduce Dennis Waring.
Good afternoon, everybody. It is indeed a great pleasure to be here on the 177th commemoration of what must be for one of the all-time great premier citizens of this town, that is Jacob Estey. Now, many of you have seen some of the slides we're going to see today before, and many of you know a few more facts than I do, and believe me, there are many fascinating nooks and crannies in this story. But given the basic time that we have, I would like to take a slightly different angle, and that is to put Jacob Estey in a larger context. He was indeed a reflection of his times, and one of the great entrepreneurs of the day. But before I do that, may I all too briefly express thanks to Jeff Berry, whose slides we will see today come predominantly from his collection. Jeff's legacy, his life's work, his contribution to the history, to the visual history of this town is incalculable. This man is given, probably has the largest library of anybody of slides and visual material that should be maintained, conserved, and cherished for generations to come. Also in memory of Dick Mitchell. When I began my research, it was Dick who took me to the out-of-the-way places and gave me information that I would never been able to get from any books, things that are insider pieces of information. The man was generous with his time, and I have the fondest of memories of this great gentleman. Let me also thank John Carnahan, Jerry Gatz, Barbara George, and the Brattleboro Historical Society for their support, their help, and their ongoing commitment to the past of this town. Seems a little hard maybe for an outsider, or maybe even an insider, to fully appreciate that for 100 years this town owed a major part of its success and prosperity to the Estey Organ Company. Estey's story is a classic Victorian saga in the best of Horatio Alger traditions. He was self-made, he was self-improved, he rose to a position of prominence, and after his 500,000 reed organs were shipped to as the poster said, from the far-off pines of Siberia to the golden shores of the Pacific, which is during a time we must remember transoceanic travel was still a very adventurous and chancy proposition. Estey was, in fact, to reed organs what Stradivarius was to the violins, and what Steinway was to the piano. My personal assessment, after spending many years looking into the man's life, was that he was one of the greatest, and I'm sure one of the most honorable of all 19th century entrepreneurs. Well, what is this thing we call the Victorian era, the Gilded Age? It was roughly based on a time of the British monarch, Queen Victoria, who reigned from 1837 to 1901. And generally, we can say that America was coming of age. Before I present the slides, let me just take a moment to refresh your memories about this important time in our history when there was much turmoil and much growth. Politically and economically, after the Revolution, 1776, America was going through various stages of weaning itself from European influence. The first stage was just to take what Europe had to offer and use it. Secondly, we adopted and adapted what Europe had to offer. And lastly, we gained our final economic and political independence from Europe. Growing pains were abundant. They were manifest by the assassination of 4 presidents, the impeachment of another. The nation admitted 12 new states, which doubled its geography, making it by 1912 the largest continental republic in the world at that time. Americans voted 10 constitutional amendments, 7 of which became law by 1920. The country's population, number of foreign-born, suicides, industrial laborers, divorces, gross national product, and white-collar workers all doubled during this period of tremendous change. Industrially, that trait called Yankee ingenuity began to play a large part in our development. Simple things, like the hand axe, which in England was a heavy, short, stubby, ill-balanced iron tool, developed into a beautifully elegant, lengthened, steel, well-balanced implement in the United States. After all, wood and survival were synonymous in our early chapters. Things like the rifle. In England, it was a short, stubby thing. You almost had to run right up to your opponent to kill them or to wound them. Well, in America, there were long distances to deal with and a different terrain. So the long rifle was developed. And of course, we have much lore in the spirit of Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone to suggest that this was indeed one important item in a list of many items. Machines like Whitney's cotton gin, Samuel Slater's carding machine, and Oliver Evans' steam engine far outdistanced any of those that were happening in Europe during this time. At the International Exposition in London in 1851, our carriages, our schooners, steamships, pianos, and countless other gadgets that developed from this Yankee ingenuity showed the world that, yes, we were a little short on history, a little short on culture, but we were big on mechanical ability and cleverness. Americans soon realized that maybe it wasn't the fine arts, but it was the industrial arts at which we excelled. Socially, In spite of our founding fathers' idealism, we began to realize that democracy with equality for all was maybe never to become a reality. In fact, industrialism, with its promises, actually increased the distances between the classes instead of decreasing that distance. The emerging middle class began to develop its own modes of expression through the arts, mixing sort of some European models with the rough and tumble realities of the American frontier. These were the beginnings of popular culture. In literature, we have these now very familiar names: Bret Harte, Horatio Alger, dime novels, Mark Twain, who, by the way, preferred the reed organ over the piano. We had all manner of journals, story magazines, weekly newspapers. Printing had really become the primary mode of advertising. In popular art, the lithographs and visual imagery of Currier and Ives told us who we were and what we were to be. And the sculpture of John Rogers was found in most middle-class homes as a status symbol, a symbol of artistic appreciation. Religious revivalism was huge during this period, and still is today, isn't it? We had Dwight L. Moody and Henry Ward Beecher. It's amazing. I just finished reading a book about Victorian America and sort of preparing my mind for this presentation. And most of the things that we think are modern, are up to date, are sort of avant-garde, cutting edge, started during this period, the Victorian period, over 100 years ago. Things like the Chautauqua Institutes, Barnum's Circus, and big league baseball flourished. In the theater, we had light musicals, minstrelsy, and comic opera. These were the primary fare, and they paved the way for now very popular or familiar historical venue like vaudeville, moving pictures, and jazz. Now, artistically, most critics consider the Victorian era, with all its gingerbread excess, rather artless. I mean, after all, it was when neo-Gothic revival styles kind of were laid on top of neo-classic or Greek revival styles, and onto that were sort of pasted a little bit of neo-Rococo style and various other trends, depending on how the manufacturers and the artists were feeling at the day. But though it's said that the Victorian period maybe didn't have a style, we have no trouble in recognizing Victorian architecture and art. Generally, these things were considered in bad taste, but now we see them as an expression, a heartfelt, a real attempt at expressing various insecurities in our society at that time, which was fueled by increased stratification, massive immigration, and a dire search for a national identity. At home, people gathered around their reed organs. They sang the old sentimental tunes that sound incredibly drippy and overly nostalgic to us today. In fact, I think we would be quite remiss, if you all would like to take your stations, I would feel remiss if we did not actually listen to some of the music. After all, we're talking about reed organ music. And so, thanks to Mr. E.A. Bodway from Claremont, New Hampshire, and I have the fondest of memories. Mr. Bodway took me from church to church and town hall to town hall and school to school on a very drippy fall New Hampshire afternoon one week, and showed these organs to me and increased my appreciation, and also suggested to me that this is not just a historical artifact, that these tools of music are still with us and are still very much important. And also I want to thank Charles Emmond, who is a vocalist from Claremont, who is going to assist Mr. Bodway in singing two numbers right out of the Estey method. And we're going to start with the first one. I believe you have these here, so you can follow along and increase your musicological awareness. I believe we'll start with Call Me Thine Own, am I correct? By a composer, Halavi. He's a French composer, and this particular one is taken from an 1835 opera by the name of Leclerc. Now we must understand that these tunes taken from operas, of course, gave people a little sense of cultivation, of artistry, even though they may not have sounded quite as good as we will hear today. So let's listen to this, follow along. Yes, sir.
Have enough copies for everyone. Sorry. If you're somebody who has one craft, look at it. Otherwise, this is my night.
And then we will do just a little bit of, as we say in ethnomusicology, a little deep analysis on it. Okay? May I turn it over to you, gentlemen?
Music sweet, it falls on
40 material. A demanding song, after all, it is from an opera, and took some skill, but I don't think skill was really the point here. These songs were well practiced over long periods of time, over and over and over again. It was a chance for people to get together. The theme, like most love songs, is filled with sort of archetypal images and commonplace symbolism that wandered from song to song. And like most love songs of this genre, it's depicted as sort of a formal and idealized love, genderless, sexless. But maybe that was the answer to an age filled with contradiction. If we looked at some of the sentences here in verse 2, years may roll on, youth's dreams may leave us, hopes faint and die that lighted our way, trials may come, sorrows may grieve us, friends may depart, or falsely betray. Whew. This is really a large burden, isn't it? So we have these insecurities of aging, separation, deception, the unknown. Basically, I think concerns of a largely migrant population. If you weren't coming in from another country, you were probably moving within this country. There's a tremendous amount of moving around. Let's see, other little items in here in verse 1, the third line down, tells of hope, life's pathway cheering, whispers of home. Now this whole idea of the home, again, as the most hallowed Victorian haven, is expressed all the way through the expressive culture. Further on down, we have, with love in our hearts, heaven still remains. Again, this idealized aspect of love as having a sacred aspect. And finally, toward the bottom, Mr. Evan pulled this off without even a flinch, but you can imagine somebody in their parlor coming along on that last line, call me thine alone, and then look at the music as it goes way up, name fond endearing, right? Poor guy, here you are hung up on a high G with a fermata over it that says you got to hang on to it on the syllable ing. Well, somebody was just not thinking when they did that. But fun. We have to keep a bit of a sense of humor as well. So let's sample this next one, which has a similar spirit. It's called "I Cannot Sing the Old Songs," words and music by Clarabelle. Clarabelle was a pen name for an English songwriter, a woman, which maybe is why she decided to use a pseudonym instead of her own name, Charlotte Allington Bernard. She lived 1830, 1869, and this one is maybe a little more approachable in terms of what we might consider appropriate parlor music.
My God.
join in on the third verse. Gotta try. Shall I conduct? You'd like to. Here we go, everybody. I cannot sing the old songs, for visions come again, of golden dreams departed, and years of weary pain. Perhaps when earthly fetters shall have set my spirit free, my voice can know the old songs for all eternity. My voice can know the old songs for all Well, you don't fully appreciate just how tricky these are, right? Until you actually try them yourself. Well, what is this about? I cannot sing the old songs I sang long years ago. Well, the pain is bittersweet and very non-specific. It seems one of the great charms of music is its ability to its power to rekindle memory. But we don't know exactly what the memory is. The listener has to provide their own poignant past. And believe me, there are many of these types of memories that may have been part of the pain. The lost family. Maybe it was joyful. Remember joy. That can bring tears as well. Or one of many social inequities of the day. Suffering of the poor. Addiction to gambling. Mistreatment of orphans. The injustice done to the Indians and blacks. The insane and blind. The obstacles of immigration. There were many things to remember and try to transcend. Thankfully, the final strain, the last verse says, offers a little respite. Perhaps when earthly fetters shall have set my spirit free, my voice may know the old songs for all eternity. Well, musically, there's a few interesting items to note. The sort of general upward leap. I cannot sing the old songs. You start low and you jump up to this note, and then you come on down. The melody descends a little bit. And it's a very kind of common musical sigh motif used in much of this music. And the last line, I cannot sing the old songs, right? I mean, we're going kind of finding our way up there slowly, sort of pulling it out, wrenching our heartstrings, and yanking on those tears for all it's worth. So, I cannot sing the old songs, and Call Me Thine Own are two now long forgotten tunes that were obvious favorites of the day. Keyboards in general were the most popular instruments. The piano was the status symbol to go for. If you had a piano in your parlor or in your drawing room, everybody knew that you were climbing the ladder of success in a very meaningful way. Not everybody could afford a piano. So a reed organ then was the answer. To have some sort of keyboard in your house was better than nothing. Reed organs were much cheaper. You might spend $100 or less for a reed organ, whereas a piano might cost $300-500 or more. Reed organs were more portable. Many of the early models were small. You could even hold them on your lap. They didn't require much maintenance unless a mouse found its way into your bellows. But there was no tuning, there was no high tension strings to pull the instrument apart over a period of time. So they were attractive in many ways. Okay, so much for the backgrounds. Without any further ado, let's go directly to some of the visual information that we have. And I think a good place to start is with the trade cards and the posters of the day, the advertising. And trade cards indeed were the primary mode of trying to entice people into investing in one of their instruments. Here is our man, Jacob Estey, a very popular photograph. We can see that he has approaching or has reached grand old man status here. We see kind of a mellowness, but a sensitivity in his eyes of a man who has seen and experienced life to its fullest. The image is almost saintly and iconoclast in its demeanor. And it indeed is a very attractive symbol for the entire Estey enterprise. One of the most popular and informational or information-filled posters was this one. Here we see an obvious upper-class context. Everything is elegant and fashionable. The Italianate drapes, the layered carpets, stenciled walls, classical bust, and Saint Cecilia at her keyboard, the portrait on the wall, the muse of music overseeing the affair. The attire is formal, notwithstanding the fact that it looks like midday. The women are very curvy. After all, it was said that women had to be curvy in those days, and this curviness was enhanced by all manner of well, you get what I mean. Another important factor here is the ratio of men to women. This is something that I will meditate on as we proceed. This was an instrument that women were expected to play more so than men. Our chaperone over in the left side of the picture, with their head sort of thrown back a little bit in a rather awkward but maybe meditative pose, looking like she's being transported by the music. And our two children looking out the window. Now, when you stop and think about it, we have probably 3 generations. The children, the actual participants, and the chaperone, suggesting that making music around the reed organ was an occasion for the generations. It brought people together. It strengthened the fiber of the family. Of course, the young child with his arm thrown endearingly around his sister's shoulder suggests that the music could calm the savage youngster, make them behave and even be affectionate toward each other. It was a usual lithographic technique during this period for somebody to be pointing at something. And indeed, we see Jacob Estey's factory, his Bird Street factory, incidentally, but nonetheless importantly, out there in the distance. Look a little bit closer in the right hand of the slide. Sure enough, Estey or his lithographers always seem to work in this very same image that we saw in the previous slide. And if we could get out our magnifying glasses, underneath the canopy of the reed organ, that high top, is a picture of the master himself, Ludwig van Beethoven. After all, Beethoven was a high-class performer. We knew that he hobnobbed with royalty. So let's put a picture of him in the reed organ to make it even more effective. And finally, if we could look very closely, we would see that the young woman is indeed playing out of the book that we used for our very own little parlor concert here, the Estey organ method. After a while, this very same poster was colorized. Now you can imagine that a little bit of color to people maybe who lived on the frontier and had those bleak winters to weather, or maybe even in Vermont with its difficult winters. A little color coming through the mail was indeed a cause for celebration and fun, gathering around the table and enjoying its brightness. Now what do we see that's different in this one than the previous one? Yes?
Butler
See?
on the right.
Oh, okay, good, yes. Yeah, we have this guy on the right. Where did he come from? I don't know.
Money.
Is he a butler? Well, he looks rather butlerish, doesn't he? Or maybe somebody, I don't know. It's hard to say exactly, but yes, probably a butler or another man at least. It was interesting that they generally cut him off in this slide. Maybe he was getting too pretentious, though that's hard to believe. At any rate, to have a butler in your home really suggested upper class, high class leanings. Also, the chaperone's head, they fixed it. Over here, I mean, it looks just a little uncomfortable. It looks like it's about to fall right off her body. And here they put it on straight. Kind of interesting little additions. The organ that was used in those slides was, or generally for Estey advertising, was this one, the new salon organ. This seemed to be one of the great favorites, an actual display piece of furniture. Unlike the piano, whose cabinetry was functional, that is, it had to hold those strings apart, and it often took the shape of its interior workings, the reed organ developed far in excess of its actual needs, functional needs. So it became an actual piece of furniture. In fact, believe it or not, even with its verticality, it took up much less space. Now, when you consider that the parlors these days were already filled to the hilt with all manner of fluffy furniture and bric-a-brac, then utilizing that vertical space in many cases was a very practical idea. Also, organs like this began to show off the application of new manufacturing techniques. More about that later. It's a little known fact that the reed organ actually did exceed the piano in its popularity for more than a half century. Getting back to our theme with women and around the reed organ, there was women reigned over the household. The symbol of womanhood at this time was a very idealized symbol, and the parlor was, of all the rooms in the house, sort of her main interior room. It was a place where women could show off their best items, even the various shelves and so forth on the reed organ, though we don't see them here so much, were for various kinds of bric-a-brac and items that were significant to the people themselves. It was not only things like the reed organ, but other devices like the sewing machine and the washing machine. In fact, it was the advent of the sewing machine and washing machine that theoretically liberated women so that they would have time to give themselves over to more artistic pursuits, which set them a step or two above the working class immigrants. Oh, there's one other thing about the slide that intrigues me. That's the view through the window. Here we have a kind of an unusual Gauguin-esque kind of foliage that would be, I think, a little bit more appropriate down in South America or someplace than in Vermont.
They've added 2 buildings to the factory.
Okay, good. And we have the full. Oh, are there 10 there?
There's like 9 or 10.
There's 9 or 10. I never noticed that. Thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, they expanded the building beyond reality. Well, this was not an unusual trick. I'm glad you pointed that out. This sort of ecclesiastical theme. There was a definite sacred secular dichotomy around the reed organ. The reality was that you would seldom find women playing organ in the church. After all, the women's place was in the home. If ever we found men playing the organ, it was usually at the club or, as I suggested, in the church. However, there was a transfer of Christian virtue to the home. There were church associations of the organ, especially with those like we see that had probably dummy pipes that were really non-functional, that were decorative, but that gave, again, this symbol of sacredness, verticality, reaching toward the heavens, and these other kinds of churchly connections. In fact, we had, you could say, kind of a sonic morality going for us here. And we see these stained glass window books strewn rather haphazardly on the floor with Batiste and Bach on them. So definitely this poster, this trade card, is trying to tell us some very subtle, psychologically important things about women, the reed organ, and sacred topics. Here, though, in spite of what I just said, we do find a man at the reed organ, sort of bolstering this idea of the organ and sacred topics. Reed organs were suitable for small churches, small congregations that couldn't afford a pipe organ. And it was not unusual for leaders in reed organ manufacture to also be leaders in their church. After all, Estey and his son, Julius J., were deacons and had quite a bit of responsibility in the local church, as I'm sure you know. There were other themes here. The organ as man trap was a very sort of ubiquitous image that we see. Now, this is a brand new slide that we found, and I really didn't notice this until a little while ago when I was previewing them to make sure I had them all lined up right side up, that this doesn't look quite like a reed organ, does it? But the fact of the day was that since space was at a premium, multifunction furniture was often devised. My guess is that this is actually a reed organ, but that it probably also doubled as a writing desk. So here we have the woman maybe getting ready or having just finished her seduction, as it were, and the man waiting patiently for whatever the next step might be. After all, in the Victorian period, given its very restrictive moral code, there were not too many occasions where men and women could get together on a sort of a quasi-romantic purpose that was looked on as okay by family and friends. After marriage, the reed organ was, I love this one. After marriage, the reed organ was supposed to have relieved the husband's vexation, the children's restlessness, and the woman's own sorrow and hardship. Now again, we have to remember that these little parlor musicales were not one-shot concerts, but more a continuing social institution. Songs were sung over and over and over again, and there was ample opportunity for one to improve their delivery. Another theme that we see, maybe more often than any other theme, is the inclusion of children in advertising. Now this gets a little silly. In fact, they even get sillier because where is the organ? Well, it's probably not there because children sitting and by a reed organ is kind of a ridiculous sight. They're too short. Their feet won't reach the pedals, and it just doesn't make sense. However, the theme of children has been, even to today, has been a popular symbol because it speaks again of the generations passing, the importance of music for all generations. Here we have little Adam and Eves. In fact, in this case we have Eves. That's an important point to notice. These are all young girls, not a young boy in sight. And here we have little Eves, as it were, innocent before biting the apple of knowledge, of hard knocks. So we have innocence and playing everything but a reed organ. Their happy demeanor is charming and entrancing, and hopefully would make you want to buy a reed organ. There are all manner of children in more humorous contexts. Here we have the Estey sign either being torn down or set up. I'm not sure which. And this sort of cartoon theme, a very light and cheerful way of getting us attracted to reed organs. A full-fledged parade coming right through your very own parlor. Well, this is a curious one. Again, this is a brand new one, and I haven't had a chance to study it until just a few moments ago. And I noticed some interesting items here. Not only do we have a reed organ, I'm sure this is a much later advertisement, because we have what I'm going to guess is an Estey piano over on the left, as well as an Estey organ on the right. On the far left, we have a gentleman with his moniker and his hi-hat and his tuxedo, his cane in the parade. Maybe this again is suggesting that we have a high-class element here. And how about the guy in front of him? Isn't that an Irish leprechaun? Very well could be. So maybe there's an immigrant theme. And how about the guy right behind him, just to the right? Looks like a pretty kind of working-class fella, doesn't it? With his mustache and his kind of Eastern European hat and so forth. Well, I don't know. It's very curious. Once you get sensitized to advertising, you see what advertisers try to do, working these subtle, almost subconscious themes. And we still see these tricks today on television and in newspapers. Ah, yes, patriotism. Boy, I tell you, you've got some real important symbols here. First of all, we have a lovely-looking feminine child, again, draped in the American flag, the eagle mounted to her breast with General Washington, George Washington, in her right hand, and Abraham Lincoln in her left, the great fathers of our country. Well, what do you say about this? Much more acceptable in those days than these days. But the idea here is that even though it's unacceptable, racial theme with today's awareness, we have a humorous item. Again, that has really nothing much to do with reed organs, but something that will attract your attention. It will give you a little visual joy and get its subconscious message into your mind. Later on, we began to get into another category of trade card iconography, that of more exotic topics. After all, this was an age of exploration and colonialism. And the more exotic it was, the more fascinating it became. So we have this woman playing plucking a harp amongst this kind of vine foliage with its very, very beautiful colors and its modern graphics and so forth. As the art Nouveau style came into vogue, naturally this was incorporated as well in the advertising. In fact, when we get to slides like this, with color, it becomes incredibly seductive. This Greek goddess with her provocative pose and drapery, holding, of all weird instruments to choose, a Middle Eastern karar in her hands. Absolutely very little to do with reed organs, yet we are attracted to it, and again, its message, subliminal message, becomes stuck in our brains. A humorous one, Romeo and Juliet. Now you tell me what this has to do with reed organs. Don't have a clue, but it is kind of fun, strumming on his tennis racket, showing sort of a leisure time theme here, and making his overture to his true love. Again, a theme that transcends any particular historical era. Maybe the most popular, the one that we see everywhere, was this poster. And these posters are quite large, too. You can't miss them. Many manufacturers of the day use the factory itself as a symbol for their modernity, their industrial clout. But there are other themes worked in here. In the lower left-hand corner, as we'll find out, are the three mainstay partners of the Estey Organ Company. And in the right, back to the parlor with our woman approaching the reed organ for a little musical soiree. And the street, those of you who live in town here, teeming with activity. Well, as we will see in many of these, the various things that are added to it are sometimes a little aside from what the reality may be. The ever-smoking chimney is another important symbol here. The expanse of the factory behind with all its various kinds of activity. Right in the nexus of action. And this is a new one too. Boy, they really packed it in here. We see various individual parts of the factory. Again, lots of activity on the street. The flag waving in the breeze, often an American flag. And my guess is on the lower right-hand, lower left-hand corner of the dry house, I'm not sure why that's particularly featured. As a woodworker, I certainly know how important this is, but I don't know what the advertising aspect is, except that it maybe was a new or expanded addition to the factory. It's hard to tell. Okay, let's turn the chapter here and see where all this began. Now, reed organs had been around in Europe for a while, and as I mentioned earlier in this presentation, we as Americans began to copy that which was popular in Europe. And one of the things that did come over were the small melodeons. We'll see in just a moment. But this was considered the first site of melodeon making activity in Brattleboro. It was Smith and Woodcock's grist mill up the road in Centerville. The Jones brothers, among many other people who used this building for various enterprises, in 1846 were the first to actually build musical instruments there. The building, of course, is no longer there. However, Dick Mitchell took me there, and we we walked way down in the ravine, and sure enough, there are still a few foundation stones from the old water wheel that helped motivate this tower, this grist mill. What did the instruments look like? Well, they started out more or less like this. Rocking melodeons, sometimes called teeters, sometimes called elbow machines, because you had to hold it on your lap and rock it back and forth like a ship on a rough sea. It almost makes you seasick just to watch somebody perform on one of these lovely little lap-held instruments. The buttons are reminiscent of a concertina or of an accordion. In fact, those of you who may not know quite as much about reed organs, it was the same type of reed that we do find on harmonicas and concertinas and accordions that are inside of these instruments. We call them free reeds. Now, this developed over a period of time and started taking on a slightly more sophisticated arrangement. You can see that the keys now have that classic sort of row along the bottom, and then the familiar 3-2, 3-2, 3-2 arrangement with flats and sharps like we find on today's pianos. In fact, it wasn't long. Oh, here we go. Now, this is Ned Phoenix here, who lives in Jamaica, and some of these slides you'll see are from his instrument making, or instrument repair rather, shop. And he was nice enough to pose for me so that you could see how this instrument was usually utilized. And it wasn't long until we actually added piano keys to the instrument so that it would become a little easier to play and more genericized equivalent to a piano. Doesn't take a lot of imagination to figure out the next step. Putting legs on it so you didn't have to hold it. You didn't have to use your elbow to push the bellows up and down. Now you could use your feet so that greater facility was afforded for the fingers, and increased range then came about. So you got higher notes and lower notes. As I mentioned earlier, the piano was the highest of all status symbols, and many pianos of that day were in a square style, like the one we see below. So by putting reed organ works inside of a square piano cabinetry, we could sometimes fool our neighbors psychologically into thinking we were a little bit more high class than maybe we actually were, that we spent a little bit more money on this than maybe we really did. To make a very long story short, we could go on and on and on about this. I would refer you maybe to Mr. Bodway if you want to know or Ned Phoenix, the details. These are two gentlemen who are expert in these areas. But to get on with it, we eventually began to see enclosure of the cabinetry and the classic sort of gingerbread styles with its display areas and its reaching toward the heavens in a Gothic ecclesiastical gesture. These were two quite popular ones that were taken from the Estey catalogs. Boy, look at the hips on this one. I mean, this one just makes me really something. I love it. The excessive cabinetry, the robustness, the pipes, the functionless pipes, all this is truly in the Victorian spirit. Often salesmen said that people didn't really even question what was inside the cabinets. They were much, much more concerned about the high top that they were going to add to their organ. Well, okay, where does Estey figure in? Well, to many of you, the Estey saga is familiar. Estey, as a young man, was farmed out, as they say, by his parents Many families were so large that the family couldn't afford to keep them. So they essentially orphaned them or hired them out to families who needed more help on their farms. However, Estey's new family was not very kind, and story has it that he got a whipping once in a while and decided to run away with the help of one of his fellow hired hands. He went to Worcester, Massachusetts, worked his way through school as a plumber, or learned the plumbing trade, I should say, and returned at the age of 20 for his father's funeral. Again, there are many details here that we don't have time to look at. I would refer you to my work in the library or at the Historical Society for the details. As he came, he decided to stay when he came back, and he bought in with Stephen Parker as a plumber. It was Pipes and Pumps were the name of the game then, and this was the Valley Mills Company, the site of many early manufacturing efforts in town. And Estey worked at the plumbing business around the mid-1850s. Now, all these Estey sites gets very confusing, but we generally agree that as he bought out Stephen Parker and expanded his venture, and believe me, throughout this time, he was developing a tremendous sense of entrepreneurial acumen, and the man hustled. He was a real comer in several areas. He dealt with not only pipes and pumps, but also marble and slate, and sold lumber from horse-drawn wagons, and bought into various other enterprises that came and went during that time. In fact, it's amazing the number of partnerships and turnovers that Estey and his fellow entrepreneurs had to go through before they finally either went bottoms up or found their level of success. It was during this time, however, that Estey became interested in melodeons. We see a sign there right below the man standing in the doorway on the second floor, Estey and Green. Now, Estey traveled around at this time in a horse-drawn wagon in quite a large area. New York State, even up to Canada, Massachusetts, around Vermont, of course, and so forth. This was no mean task in those days of paveless roads. And over a period of time, he found that music was becoming an American passion. After all, we had Jenny Lind, we had Old Bull. It was a time of making song. And he began to carry a few of these little melodeons around with him, along with his lumber and his other types of fare. And people, he always came back without them. Once in a while, since Estey was not really a musician, he'd take a boy along who could play a few tunes on it. And he was heard to say that if he could get one of these instruments into a neighborhood, he was bound to be able to go back and sell more of them. Here we have another view of this. I will put these various sites in perspective on a map in just a moment, so you can see various moves that he had to go through. This shop, as many enterprises, happened to many enterprises, burned on September 4th, 1857 at 1:30 a.m. Unfortunately, it was the firemen, half of the fire department was away on muster up in Massachusetts. And because of this, many buildings burned down and many businesses were lost. Estey was not to be daunted, though. He was bound to rebuild. Now, during this time, the square piano organ, the square cabinetry, became a little bit more popularized just to keep track of what was being manufactured during these times. It was the Plaza, what is now the Plaza Park, what we call the Plaza Park site around 1860, where organs generally began to take on a somewhat Victorian look. Estey was way ahead of his time because most enterprises used water power, but Estey saw the wave of the future and decided to use steam power. This was good and bad. It was good because it was modern and it gave you consistent around the year, around the clock power, but also you had this fire element to contend with. During this time, this particular one I believe is around 1864, another fire devastated the shop, but he rebuilt. Now, early on, he was starting to employ people. He employed 20 men, and they said that 10 instruments a week were coming off the line. And one of his better weeks grossed $6,000. Now, while he was keeping things cranking at this particular Plaza Park site, he decided to build elsewhere. He was beginning to expand. So we have this Frost Street location, built around 1866, and it boasted of a larger steam engine in that little adjoining building. He was smart enough to separate the steam apparatus from the building in case there was a fire that got out of control. The steam engine also ran water through, or steam rather, through pipes that were laced throughout the factory and afforded heat during these Vermont winters. And one of the last elements of modernity were an actual Otis Brothers power elevator that helped him transfer things from one floor to the other. Here's the same building again, an actual photograph. Now, while both of these factories were cranking, the Plaza Park site and the Frost Street site, they employed about 110 men. So you can see that he was wasting no time in developing this enterprise, and 160 organs a month were coming off of the assembly line. Also, he was expanding, tremendously expanding, from roaming around the countryside in a horse-drawn wagon to sending his organs to far-off places, various spots in Europe, and even as far as the East Indies. Well, times were tough. It was these floods of these fires that seemed to decimate so many enterprises, and sure enough, the flood of 1869 carried away the great majority of Estey's lumber, along with one of his employees, who rode the lumber down the Connecticut River, down the Whetstone rather, into the Connecticut River to his eventual demise. This made him consider a move away from all this water. After all, he didn't need it anymore anyhow, and to consider what he was going to do with this fire problem. There was more than he could handle. He had been through all these partnerships. It was time. Now he had enough experience to really focus in and mature his what he had developed over the past 20 or so years. The two people he brought into his partnership were his son on the left, Julius J. Estey, and a true Renaissance man, I will tell you more about later, Levi Fuller. This is one of my favorite photographs, and of course, what's the organ that they chose? The new salon organ, the one that we see in much of the advertising. Here's our map. I tried to give us a little idea of the various locations. Correct me if I'm wrong, please. I believe number 1 over there by the river was his first, not where he built organs, but where he first engaged Stephen Parker in the pipe and pump trade, plumbing trade. Number 2 was the where he built his first melodeon, Estey in green, and started making melodeons proper along with slate and lumber and so forth. Building number 3 is the Plaza Park site, And then after that burned down, even though it was rebuilt, he decided to expand up on number 4 Frost Street. At this point, Estey said, okay, it is time to go for it. And as we can see there on the left part of the slide, he expanded with a vengeance and set up about 60 acres up on the terrace, the outcropping above town, what we now know as Bird Street, and began his classic, wonderful set of buildings. He did not build all 8 of them at one time. It's hard to find photographs or lithographs of pictures that show less than 7 or 8. However, once again, I have to chuckle when I see this incredible amount of activity. Now maybe there was. I mean, after all, there was a tremendous number of employees, but this lithograph makes it look like a real nexus of social interaction. Like you would go up there to take your Sunday stroll. And maybe this was a fact, but I think maybe some of it was hype as well.
It's also in a mountainous territory.
That's a good, thank you. Thank you for mentioning that. Yeah, look at that great big mountain behind the factories. What's the name of that mountain? Well, you know, somebody tore the mountain down, I guess, because...
The street is remarkable, too.
Yes, right. That mountain is a figment of somebody's imagination, basically. Well, this is the reality. This is what makes me wonder about strolling down this street with your finery on a Sunday afternoon. It was kind of muddy, kind of narrow, and kind of deserted. From another view, aren't these fantastic slides? I just revel in this, how it used to be. They're so monumental, and they continue to be monumental even today. Now we're talking around early 1870s, when we did have finally, I believe, the full set of 8 buildings. Oh, I'm sorry, before I go on, may I mention a couple of other things about Estey's ingenuity here, his cleverness. As most of you know who have been there, they're separate, so that if one of them decides to burn, the idea was that the flames would not jump from building to building and demolish his entire enterprise. Also, the various cornices and so forth were covered in tin, non-burnable, non-flammable material, and as we know, the roofs and all the walls were clad in slate to keep any sparks. Now, each one of these had an elevator. There were connections between the buildings, second-story bridges, so that you didn't have to go necessarily outside to get from building to building. And they boasted of gas light, so that work could be done at the nighttime, and steam heat. So it was really quite innovative, quite modern, and beautifully, elegantly designed for the time. His competition, and believe it or not, there was competition in town. I mean, who would want to go up against Estey? But Mr. Carpenter was one of the first organ manufacturers in Brattleboro. And in fact, they were partners for a while. As Estey branched off into his own effort, Carpenter continued to build organs on a more limited basis in town. And his other great competition, who bought that same building a little later on, was a man named Silas Waite. Now, Silas was an interesting character. He was maybe more in the spirit of Victorianism because he tended to be a little crooked in some of his dealings. And he took Estey to court, to make a long story short, over a reed organ innovation. And Estey said that this was a false accusation, so he pursued it. And it actually made it to the Supreme Court. And litigation dragged on and on and on for actually a period of about 14 years. It dragged on. Silas Waite was a very prominent citizen. He was a banker and so forth. But pretty soon, after he made a little bit too much of a row, and people began to look into his affairs, and they found out that sure enough, he was embezzling money from the bank and had other skeletons in his closet. and pretty soon the next morning when they went to get him, he was gone. However, they found him, and of course this shed a whole new light on the litigation in the Supreme Court as well. Eventually, Estey did win the case. People who left us diaries always mentioned that there is these horse-drawn wagons constantly, trains of them going up and down the hill from the Birch Street factory to the now very busy railroad station. We'll see a picture of that in just a moment. And sometimes even Estey himself rode up and down these wagons, putting the boxes on the trains to go to far-off places. Just a little interesting note here. Estey always liked to boast. This is maybe one of the very few, if maybe the only item I've been able to find where Estey maybe kind of bent the truth just a teeny bit. But it was a very commonplace to do that. It says, Estey, Oregon, established 1846. The fact is, he really didn't start getting interested in organs until the next decade. However, there's some truth in it because the Jones brothers did begin their enterprise of making melodeons in Brattleboro around 1846. So that's what Estey claimed, just to give himself that sense of having been around, that sense of longevity and stick-with-itness of history. Well, here's the train station, which is no more. Beautiful example of Victorian architecture. And from this point, organs departed everywhere. This photograph is around 1900. Industrialism had its many symbols. The clock became important and was one of the great items on the front of the Estey factories. It suggested, it bespoke of regimentation of the workforce. Time was no longer passed, but time was spent. It is telling us that time is money. I love the little squiggle on the top of the clock here. The idea was to make sure that everybody was putting in their time for the good of the cause. Dick Mitchell was kind enough to take me up into some of the buildings, and sure enough, the clockworks are still there in slight disrepair, but I have to continue to marvel over the aesthetic aspect of this machinery. Yes, they were machines, but they were magic enough to the people who built them that they took time to make them pieces of mechanical beauty as well as functional. The whistle was one of the symbols that you couldn't get away from if you wanted to. They said on a quiet day you could hear this whistle 6 miles away. It marked the boundaries. It had much more application than just marking the boundaries of the workday. The whistle also was a signal for the curfew for the town's children at 9 o'clock in the evening. Early in the morning, it was a signal for workers to stand clear of all the belting in the factories before the engineer decided to set the machines in motion. And as Lower says, when the 5 o'clock whistle blew, quote, the sidewalks were black with Estey employees coming out of the factories. One other of the great symbols of the day was this huge Corliss steam engine. It displayed and working at the Philadelphia Centennial of 1876. This was truly a masterpiece of technology. The thing generated 1,400 horsepower, weighed 680 tons, stood 40 feet high, powered 8,000 machines, and had miles and miles of belting. It said that America had industrial clout that was not to be threatened by any other country. Well, Estey's Corliss was not quite as magnificent, but it was state-of-the-art and very functional. Around 1898 this was installed in the Birch Street factory, generated 100 horsepower, and as we'll see, ran lots of machines. Of course, it was a steam engine, so we had to generate the steam in the boiler room, but it was not a show of mere muscle. I mean, Estey was ecologically minded way before it was, it had a practical aspect to it too. The theme here was recycling. So these various pipes and things that led into the furnace were coming from other parts of the factory. Sawdust and wood scrap were thrown into the furnace to keep it going. The smokestack, which is no longer with us because children decided they wanted to try to climb it, and so the idea was to reduce that threat. But the smokestack was a symbol, as we see in many of the previous lithographs. There was smoke coming out of it at all times. The townspeople, in spite of the smokestack dirtying their laundry, refused to complain. As Dick Mitchell would say, complain and be damned. And so this smokestack stood 100 years as a symbol to the Estey enterprise and to his industriousness. Inside of the factory itself, we have some lovely photographs, documentation. The shop foreman over there on the side in his suit, the young boy, probably a helper, or maybe actually did some work in the factory, are telling us that there was a stratification of the workforce. Now we had the office and the workers and the overseers and the gophers and so forth and so on. But I just marvel, can you imagine with all that belting cranking at once? The noise and the cacophony must have been absolutely enormous. Here we get an unusual view. Most of the times we see it from the front of the factory. Here we have an interesting view from behind the factory. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So here's one of the few slides I found that actually has less than 8 buildings. The process was generally milling the lumber. There is a gentleman here who I think has bought the land of the original milling site. That's interesting. And here we have sort of at the beginning of this process, the employees standing in front of a lumber stack. As a woodworker myself, I know the importance of drying this lumber properly, which was probably largely oak and walnut. And Estey was very conscientious in this regard. He air dried it nice and slow for 2 years, and then cut it into usually smaller component pieces and seasoned it for an additional 2 to 6 months. So the man was very smart. Otherwise, it would warp, crack, and come back to his factory, and that is not very efficient. The lumber then went on into the factory where it was milled into various parts. It was the band saws, the circular saws, the jig saws that allowed these workers not only to assembly line, but to create beautifully ornate woodworking. Here we have this scroll work. But even if they were band sawed out, still, as a woodworker, I know there was a lot of effort in sanding, refining, fluting, and so forth. A lot of work. As it went along into the obvious here, the keyboard action department, and I will make a comment later, but let's notice at this point that there's a couple of women on the assembly line. Again, Estey was very modern and free-thinking in his ideas about enterprise. Finally, we come down to the point where the insides, or the final assembly, the insides of the organ are assembled, ready then to be boxed and to be sent out down to the railroad and out for shipment. Well, this fire thing still was haunting. I mean, after you had lost a couple of buildings to fire, you begin to be a little more cautious. And so Estey even organized his own fire department with these pumpers, these steamers as they call them, and he installed a clever machine in the factory that would connect to various boxes around the town. So if there was a fire on a particular block, the person who first noticed it would hustle over and activate this box, which would then tell a person in the factory where the fire was in the town. And then Estey was generous enough to throw in his steamer and trying to douse the fire before it caused too much destruction. Here we have a slightly larger version of this steamer and firefighting force. Not only that, but in the winter, what do you do when the water freezes and you can't put the water on the fire? Well, once again, Estey figured out that if he kept this pool of water warmed up, and you see it's right there close to the chimney. There may be a connection, I don't really know. At any rate, the pool of water kept warm through the cold months would afford water for dousing fires any time of the year. We have this lovely set of departmental photographs. And I'll have to defer to Mr. Baudouin about which department this might be. They are obviously holding on to the tools of their trade, and I just love the faces on these gentlemen. And do you have any hint as to which department these might be involved in?
Metalworking.
Metalworking, right? The little cords there down in the front center kind of gives a clue. We have a series of these, and all these men with the similar aprons on makes me think that they are indeed departmental photos. A little later one, I imagine. Many of these men spent their entire lifetimes. Here's a classic photograph that's usually titled 50 Years Each for Estey. Now about this point, with women being employed, this is unusual. I start with this slide because here we have three women down in the front along with all their male counterparts. And they worked usually, of course, not in the rougher, shall we say, stages, but worked throughout the factory on many of the later stages. In fact, one of the more important aspects that they tended to be in charge of were the tuning of the reeds. Now, you can make a fine-looking organ, but if that reed isn't in tune and not working properly, then it's not good business. The men were a little jealous, a little credulous, shall we say, and the story goes that they went and complained to Jacob Estey one day about, oh, they just can't do anything with these reeds that these women are preparing. They just don't know how to do it. And so Estey had a sense of humor too, obviously. When the men were out having lunch, he snuck in and exchanged reeds that they had prepared with the ones that they thought the women had prepared. So when they came back, they continued to grouse and grumble about all these reeds that these women were messing up. And they decided to band together, so they got themselves together and huffed up a little bit and went to Jacob Estey and said, Mr. Estey, these women just can't do it. Well, Estey had him to the goods, didn't he? He said, this is what I've done. I exchanged reeds that you yourself had prepared, and you were criticizing your own work. And he went on to say, quote, when I want your advice about running my business, I will send for you. Again, these slides come from Ned Phoenix, who, along with a couple of other people who had some historical sensitivity, ran in when they started just throwing the stuff out of the organ factories and taking it down to the dump and salvaging some things. This is what a tuning table looked like during that day in the 1880s. And it looks like a surgeon's table almost, with its unusual specialized tools. And we can see that each tool had a particular purpose. Now you say, okay, where are the reeds? Well, the reeds are usually on these particular style nested underneath the keyboard. It takes a special tool to pull these reeds out in order to process them, to tune them, and to clean them. In fact, we see here this huge array of reeds. Now, it was often said that the reeds, or the sound of the reed organ, was one of its actual weakest aspects. People complained about its sort of weak, wheezy sound. And there were many experiments that were tried to give the reed organ a stronger, more powerful tone. It makes some sense that if you want a louder sound, you expand the amount of vibration, the surface area of vibration. And these were some of the ideas that were proposed. None of them were particularly successful. We really ended up basically with the same old single free reed that we started with. However, in response to this complaint, reed organ manufacturers decided to stimulate maybe not the reeds themselves, but to stimulate the imagination of those who were working the reeds. And so by giving the various reed sets important names like Vox Jubilante and Grand Organ and Flute d'Amour, they had a sense of accomplishment, a sense of a greater purpose here. Even though some of them were actually fake or really stretching things, it was one of the ways that manufacturers responded to this sort of perennial complaint. Well, back to the factories. Estey was continued to expand. He was very enterprising with his employees. This is a good time to mention the development of Esteyville, a community behind the factories that Estey encouraged and sometimes subsidized, buying houses for his employees. Here we have another angle of these wonderful buildings, and yet another with the ice pond in front, where people would saw ice to keep things refrigerated during these days. This is about a picture 1906 is the suggested date for this. All the Estey family and people who are involved had a lot of civic commitment. We have to remember that people not only work together, but they live together as well. So there was a tremendous sense of unity in Brattleboro during this time. We had the Estey Players that would put on dramatic productions. After all, there were no movie theaters and other things. If you had a show coming through, it was a time to gather together for enjoyment. If the show didn't come through, then you would make your own. There was also a glee club of Estey employees. The men, which was a very common thing, band together to create the early, this is a picture of the early Estey Guards. And largely they were into drilling and parading for various exhibitions, gatherings, and would often have friendly competitions in neighboring fields, sort of playing war and enjoying themselves. It was a recreational activity. A little bit later, this became a fairly serious enterprise. They weren't all 10 soldiers. Actually, many of them fought in 1898 in the Spanish-American War. They became so famous that they even participated in the 1876 Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia. Again, let me point out that these are all symbols of success, symbols of smart entrepreneurship. Here we actually have one that somebody was sharp-eyed enough to pick out, Julius J. Estey himself, who at these early stages appointed himself captain. At later stages, he actually earned his titles because he was an actual soldier and fought legitimately. Also, Levi Fuller, one of the Estey partners, decided to create the Fuller Battery. This is dated about 1886, and it started out with just a few men and a couple of cannon, and actually developed into quite a large troop of about 75 men. They had 4 12-pounder cannons, and Levi Fuller eventually gave it to the state, and it became sort of a national guard. But they had social function too, and they played and performed at various balls, celebrations, and other gatherings. Estey was renowned largely also through his participation in fairs. Everything from the great world fairs to the local valley fair. Here we see where he would always have a little exhibition, a little house where he could show off his organs. You see here in the early 1900s. He never came away without some sort of award at these efforts. He began to get so successful that he opened up shops in cities around the country and even in far-off places. Estey and Camp was one of the more renowned outlets. Here is another one. I'm sorry, I'm a little short on detail of these. Hey, there's the clock again, right, above the shop. And we can see here that he expanded into various cities. He had outlets in Boston, New York City, Philadelphia, Chicago, St. Louis, Detroit, Des Moines, Iowa, Atlanta, London, England, and last but not least, Rutland, Vermont. Here we see the interior of one of his more lavish shows. And there are many credits afforded the Estey agents who sold his reed organs all over the world. In Asia, Australia. It was said that one agent in Europe was receiving about 40 organs a week in those huge cabinets. So this particular agent was enterprising enough to save all the boxes and sawed them into little pieces and eventually fenced in his entire farm with the wood from the packing cases. Okay, we're talking, we're well into the early 1900s now, and we can see that business was burgeoning at least for a little while longer, and that we have a huge number of employees here. Estey afforded these people insurance, kind of a benefit association, way before it was fashionable or required to do so. And again, I want to repeat that there is a tremendous community spirit because of Estey's enlightenment and civic involvement. Finally, the buildings number, what we are numbering, calling 7 and 8, were joined. Here we have a series of slides showing that indeed it's looking a bit more modern to our eyes at any rate. In fact, to get this slide, it better be modern. We didn't tie a camera to a bird. And we see the joined buildings up there on the right end of the slide. Organ cabinetry began to change. Instead of that incredible amount of vertical aspect, we began to see more enclosure, sort of embracing the organist. And plate glass and mirrors and the usual kinds of knick-knack shelves continued to be part of this style, but we can see a rounding off in terms of its design from the earlier manifestations. As Jacob Estey got on in years, he began to turn over more and more of the enterprise to his son, Julius J. Estey, who served in the state senate in 1882 and renovated a structure that was already there, which he called Florence Terrace, and it was quite the showplace. It was said to have been sort of Romanesque in style, and many of the rooms boasted of oak and walnut trappings. The furniture in the library and the dining room were upholstered with leather. The draperies in many of the rooms were of silk plush. And the building was, the rooms were designed to open up for large gatherings. Actually, two presidents, William McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt, were entertained here in Florence Terrace by Julius J. Estey. It was smashed to bits in 1971. Levi Fuller has got to be one of the great all-time personalities in Vermont history. As I said, this man was a true Renaissance man. He's a genius. He was a metallurgist, an acoustician, an astronomer. He, of course, went on to be governor of the state, so he has very accomplished in statecraft. He had many philanthropic enterprises, and he championed black causes way before it was fashionable to do so. Here we see Governor Fuller in his study at Pine Heights, his home here in town. He's also an electrical engineer. I mean, this man, how did he do it all? I don't have any idea. When you figure the time it took to get from point A to point B, he must have been very efficient and a hard worker. In fact, his untimely, rather early death was attributed to the fact that he just could not slow down. We remember Estey, Fuller, because of several interesting items. This collection of tuning forks. Since he was an expert acoustician, he helped standardize the uniform pitch in the world, really. So when we say A440, well, Levi Fuller was one of the important people who helped to standardize this, so that when you built an organ or you transported a musical instrument from one country to another, there would be some commonality between them. This collection has the tuning forks of people like Handel and Mozart and even Richard Wagner. I got up early one morning and went up on the what used to be Esteyville, and sure enough, here's still this bandstand in Fuller Park up behind the buildings. The manufacture of the 250,000th organ was a real occasion. They invited 250,000 guests. There were sculptures of ice cream, one, of course, in the shape of a reed organ. The band played. There were speeches. There was a portrait of Jacob Estey up behind the speakers. The picture is still, by the way, or it was, in the library lounge. I went to see it a couple of years ago, and it's a beautiful portrait. If you have a chance, I'm sure they would let you take a peek, because it's really a magnificent painting. There was all sorts of music, and the evening ended with Japanese lanterns illuminating every window in the factory, and a grand display of fireworks at the very end. Jacob Estey died in 1890. He was 76 years old, basically of a heart attack. He had a very a gentle passing, and people from all over the world came to Brattleboro that day to pay their respects to this truly great man. Now, it was this 250,000th organ and the demise of Jacob Estey that ironically heralded the beginning of the end of the old style reed organs. They were starting to be outmoded by the player piano. After all, it was much easier to crank it up and let it go by itself than to learn how to deal with it. We had the beginning of phonographs found in everybody's house, and generally changing lifestyles took people away from the home. Parlor sitting was not in fashion anymore. Things changed fairly rapidly after that point. Even though Jacob Estey had passed on, they continued to use his persona as a symbol for the development in the 1900s. New people became involved. Branches continued to open up in various places like here in Chicago. The office continued to organize themselves. Business went on, but everybody could see that times had changed, and there was a general head-scratching and scramble to keep up with modern times. One of the responses to this was to bring in more people, more revenue, various other interests. Now, there are people you may recognize in this photograph. If you do, it'd be nice to put a name with the face, maybe after we're through here. Oh, may I mention too on this one that these are in what is now Barbara George's publishing company in building number 6, and this is on the first floor where we had a meeting not too long ago with the Brattleboro Historical Society. So the responses to this waning of the reed organ were to make pianos, and it was said that pianos were the coming item. Estey pianos. And there were factories in New York City that were making these pianos, and it helped to fill in the gap left by the demise of reed organs. Also, Estey organs got into making pipe organs in a very serious way. They were high-quality organs, but they had their problems, and though quite competent and serviceable, they never quite reached a standard that his reed organs seemed to reach. Story goes, most of you know about Henry Ford coming through in 1915 and ordering one of the fancier organs, and he was so intrigued by the assembly line process and the efficiency of the Estey factory that what was supposed to be a whistle stop, he decided to stick around and enjoy and study the process and probably learned a few things. And we all know the outcome of that. He also sent a little bit of money to each one of the employees after the organ was built in appreciation for their extra effort in making his organ that he put in his drawing room. Here we have women now continuing to be very important in the enterprise, making pipe organ pneumatics around 1905. Advertising didn't abate at all. Here we have, quote, the largest organ pipe in the world, right? Around 1921, displayed on this wagon at the Memorial Day Parade. Interestingly enough, it wasn't these huge organs that really kept things going. If there was one sort of bread and butter item that seemed to help them through difficult times, and there were many economic depressions during the whole enterprise, it was this small chaplain's organ, this little portable folding organ that just stayed true all the way from beginning to end. It could be sent into what were called heathen lands at the time. In fact, there were usually no place to even drop them off. So they had to come up with a special zinc-lined case. When the boat came up to the various tribes to unload this for the missionary to use, they literally dumped it over the side. The canoes would come out, drag it back to the shore, and then the missionary did their work. It was a symbol in that respect, continuing symbol of Christian salvation. It was used a lot during wartime too. to send to the boys in various places so that they could keep their morale high and keep their religious tethers intact. It was said that the great revivalist Dwight Moody and his musician counterpart Ira Sankey could move huge crowds of people with nothing but a small Estey chaplain's organ. And this was a day before they had amplification. As we near the end, there was some reshuffling, some difficulties. Of course, the Depression of 1929 was a great watershed for many enterprises, and the Estey Company suffered as much as any during this time. After that, there was a bit of a scramble to manufacture such things as full boats and skis and other kind of non-musical items, none of which were really able to take up the slack. It was an extremely stressful time for the Estey family. But in spite of that, we still have memories of the good times. Again, I got up early one morning and went up there, and it was beautiful and chilly and kind of foggy, and I got all nostalgic myself about this. Went around taking pictures of everything, including the street sign and Estey and Burge, and looked at these buildings and just marveled at how magnificent, how monumental, how absolutely unique these buildings are. If you will forgive my proselytizing just a second, this town should really take pride in these. I think we are beyond the point of not caring, and we need to begin to care about these buildings. These are a historical remembrance that has no equivalent in America. They need to be restored. Please don't let them tear them down. Please take a cue from enterprising people like Barbara George, who want to revive them, keep them alive, and contribute to this fantastic chapter in the history of Brattleboro. I am glad at least we still have the clock up there and the Estey organ sign on the front of the building to remind us that this man was truly one of the great all-time American entrepreneurs throughout our history. And that, my friends, ends my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.